The Denver Broncos have made a massive move in their front office, adding former Stanford head coach David Shaw to the mix. The brain trust keeps on growing for the Broncos. We'll tell you why this is a good thing here on today's brand new episode, Locked On Broncos.
You are Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's happening, Broncos Country? Welcome into another episode of Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you so much to everybody in Broncos Country, all the everydayers out there. Thank you so much for tuning in, making us your first listen of the day every single day. You can get this show for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. So make sure you subscribe or follow if you haven't done so already, so you never miss out on what's going on with your favorite team every single day, all year long, with the fresh, objective coverage, analysis, news, and more. You get that here, Locked On Broncos. I'm Cody Roark, Broncos reporter for Mile High Sports, joined alongside, as always, by Sayre Bedinger, site expert over there at predominantlyorange.com. And as the offseason wears on, the Broncos continue to make moves, whether that's from a roster standpoint or front office personnel. Obviously, on Thursday morning, really kind of the big news of Thursday for the Broncos was that they added former Stanford head coach David Shaw, somebody who's interviewed previously for the Broncos' vacant head coaching job. I believe it was in the 2023 cycle that ultimately led to Sean Payton being hired. But more importantly, he's a guy, like Sayre, you and I have talked about this a multitude of times, even when he interviewed initially for the head coaching job. Well, this is a guy who does so much background in terms of the scouting process. The fact that the NFL Network and all the networks like to have him on for their NFL draft coverage because of his insight as a evaluator of talent. And now he's coming into the Broncos. He's going to help evaluate pro and college talent for them in a front office role. That size of the market getting a little bit bigger here for the Broncos.
I love it. I love the creativity. I love the intentionality in terms of doing whatever it takes to get a competitive advantage. Of course, this news was initially broken by our good friend 9 News insider Mike Kliss, who said that George Paton, he specifically noted that general manager George Paton made this hire, and it's not the first move the Broncos have made this offseason to upgrade their front office, if you will. So, like you said, Cody, he's being hired in a senior personal executive role, evaluating both the college and professional talent coming in. And I can't help but wonder if that interview that he did with the Denver Broncos last year, I think he had an interview or two this offseason as well. I can't remember the specific teams. I think I remember his name popping up a time or two, but the interview process has undoubtedly helped in terms of getting back into the NFL, which has been a goal of Shaw since he stepped down from being the head coach at Stanford a couple years back. We know that he's been trying to get back into the NFL, but at what capacity? Like, you and I both kind of had the opinion last year during the coaching cycle. Remember that, hey, if Jim Harbaugh gets hired and they don't hire David Shaw, maybe Shaw would come onto his staff in some capacity. Now here we are a year later. The Broncos now have David Shaw in a executive role in the front office, and that whole process of being interviewed for head coach, they're getting asked a million questions like, how do you perceive this roster? What are the roster weaknesses? What's your vision and plan for helping this team get better? The reason that I'm so excited about this move by the Broncos is because of the fact that they already know David Shaw's answers to those questions of how are you going to make this team better? What would you do? How do you see things right now? How would you upgrade this area? What would you do at quarterback? What would be your vision here? They already know his answers. So they're not just hiring a guy that they like. They're hiring a guy that they know exactly what he would do to make the organization better. And they like that vision. They like that plan. They like his strategy. They like his eye for talent. I'm a big fan of this move, Cody. I think that, I mean, it's going to get brushed aside after a couple of days here. I think this is going to loom large over the long haul for the Denver Broncos.
Well, I think when we look at the overall perception of how Denver's built their roster, like Sean Payton has been very vocal this offseason about the pro scouting department, the analytics department, just the involvement there. And I think it kind of showcases a little bit more. We'll highlight it later on in today's episode of the show. Really, how does that work? How does that dynamic with all these voices in the building work? That's an intriguing thing that we'll follow here. But I think also an interesting note as well is like this is also something that Sean Payton himself signed off on. And he's had experience with David Shaw in the past. They coached together on the Philadelphia Eagles in 1997 as assistant coaches. So there was a little bit of an interesting dynamic there. It's like they know what they bring to the table. And look, Sean Payton is a guy who obviously knows a lot of people, knows a lot of coaches in the coaching community. This is a move that I'm very curious to see if we'll ever get that answer. We might, once training camp opens up, or even like the annual media barbecue, asking Sean, what role did you have in bringing David Shaw into the mix here for the Broncos? Because this wasn't just a George Payton decision. Like, George Payton made it happen, but he doesn't make this move happen without the approval or express written consent of Sean Payton.
Right. And I think that ownership as well. I mean, there's no doubt there's a lot of Stanford ties in the ownership group that, I mean, we'll unpack more and more of that as we continue to discuss this, but the ties that bind, right? And the people, I mean, it's a really big deal. And so there's no doubt that the whole process of Shaw being involved with Condoleezza Rice and replacing himself, I guess, as the Stanford head coach a few years back, there's deeper ties that bind here in terms of there's the interview that he had with the Denver Broncos. There's the whole relationship that he has with the ownership group, his connection to Sean Payton. Like, it really does just make a lot of sense. And I think Shaw is also probably going to help evaluate. I don't know how much of this will be a part of his job description, but maybe he'll be able to kind of give some say into how he perceives the coaching staff is doing from his seat, to say like, hey, we here's what we thought about these guys. Here's the vision that we had for them and the plan that we had for them. And we're either seeing it happen or we're not. And if we're not, we got to look at what these coaches are doing, how they're teaching things, how they're helping develop these players. And so I think it's just a fascinating hire all around. And David Shaw is such a great, he's such a great leader. He's such a great football mind. He was there at Stanford when Andrew Luck was ascending, and he was obviously there for a lot of really dominant defenses. He was there for, I mean, they built and put out a ton of offensive linemen. Certainly that's an area of expertise that he has. Sean Payton even drafted one of his guys in the first round, Andrews Pete, a few years back, when he was with the New Orleans Saints. So I'm sure there's just a ton of mutual respect here that leads to a really healthy work environment. The question is like, how do the Broncos go about that and navigate all the voices in the room, all the cooks in the kitchen, So it's a fun move. It's an exciting move. It's, I think, a really good move. It's just going to be interesting to see how they all kind of work together.
Oh, Sayre teased it perfectly here, and that's exactly what we're going to dive into here on today's episode, Locked On Broncos.
Passion, drive, and patience. The formula for winning championships is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time, or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. And with all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit, only available to U.S. customers. The Denver Broncos kept general manager George Payton this offseason, despite a lot of rumors that they might let him go. Now, George has fortified the front office with a couple of new voices, including former Stanford head coach David Shaw, and that's exactly what we're talking about and breaking down today. Are there too many cooks in the kitchen there for the Denver Broncos in the front office, and what could ultimately transpire? We're going to break that down on today's episode, Locked On Broncos, but want to say thank you and give a shout out to every single one of you that makes Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day every single day. Free and available everywhere that you get podcasts, as well as you can jump over to YouTube if you haven't already. Hit subscribe on YouTube. You can watch the show. You can do like a lot of other people are doing. Comment on my hat situation every single day over there. If you miss an episode, you might miss a different hat. So you just never know. But jump over to YouTube and do that. And hey, if you're on YouTube subscribing to Locked On Broncos, you might as well switch over from whatever national sports show you throw on TV during the day or at work and just do something a little different. Try Locked On Sports Today. It's a free 24/7 sports streaming channel on YouTube or the Amazon Fire TV channels app that's going to give you all the biggest stories, all the can't miss analysis, opinions, and news from local experts of the teams that you love that know exactly what they're talking about. So check that out, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. David Shaw has joined the Denver Broncos front office and was hired by general manager George Payton. And so I think, Cody, as we get into this, there's a lot of discussion right now about how is this going to work, right? Because the Broncos do have a lot of, you and I talked about this off the air the other day about just kind of the structure and how the culture of, the new ownership group is starting to manifest in this team, right? They were brand new as of the fall of 2022. They've had now a full year plus to kind of it's almost been 2 years since they purchased the team and implemented their culture. So you've got this kind of top down organizational sort of situation going on. How do you view a hire like this when you think about it in the context of the ownership group, general manager George Payton still being in there, all these new faces coming in, people having such prominent voices in big decision-making positions?
I mean, that's always a tough thing, right? And I think the official title now for David Shaw, from what we know, is Senior Personnel Executive. So that comes down there. But in terms of ownership taking over, I think for Greg Penner, look, and Greg admitted it when he first took the podium as the new CEO of the Broncos on the day-to-day, is that like it's a new world for him. Like he's been so used to the business side, right, of just corporate world, corporate America, Walmart, things like that. Football's a different animal. And you have to figure out how can you maybe apply some of the principles you use in your business acumen in a professional football setting. Like a lot of what Greg Penner and Kerry Walton Penner, I think they do a tremendous job of this. Their involvement and investment in the community is very, very big. But still, when it comes to football, X's and O's, the whole system on how it operates, they're still learning. Like it's still a learning process. And I think it's going to take a lot of time. I think with the Broncos from a front office standpoint, hiring as many people who have as much football experience as they do, I think that kind of helps offset that a little bit, right? Because you want to have ownership that knows what they're doing, but this is an ownership group that is fully invested in learning more on how to do the football stuff, but they're advising with people. They've advised with Peyton Manning. Condoleezza Rice, obviously, is a great example. Her football background is expansive. And now you go on from a structural standpoint, George Payton, well-respected voice in the scouting community, obviously now as a GM, taken a lot of fire, as we've talked about. Really, the biggest fire that he has taken was the whole Russell Wilson trade, knowing after the fact it didn't work out. And obviously, you offset a lot of capital to do just that. Now, if the Broncos somehow nail it with Bo Nix, the narrative on George Payton is going to change quite a bit. Look, and I think there's valid criticisms to be had of George Payton in terms of stuff that he's done, but I also look at some of the situations he has been in. He was in an unprecedented situation where he had to hire a head coach without an ownership group, without any admin present, really there. And I think that was a huge issue. Could he have maybe been a little more patient in that head coaching hire? Probably, right? It all ended in Nathaniel Hackett. We all know maybe the contingency plan was, hey, they're going to try to get Aaron Rodgers. That didn't work out. And then he went to the next thing, and he had a head coach and a quarterback that didn't mix well. And that made everything worse. And it put the Broncos in a situation where they simply didn't have time to wait around and see, especially as a quarterback got older. So that was the one move that definitely had some negative consequences here. But despite that, the Broncos have reaffirmed their commitment to George Payton. Sean Payton, contrary to what everybody thought when Sean Payton was hired, Sean Payton and George Payton have a great working relationship. It's to the point where George and Sean, they collaborate. They talk every single day, multiple times throughout the day, and they're very much in alignment on how to build the roster. But the one thing I'll also say, too, because you talk about how the Broncos navigate all the voices that are now in there in terms of your scouting department, Sean, I think, is very much like he lets the people who have been hired to do those jobs. He's not a micromanager. He's not going to step on their toes. Ultimately, for him as a head coach, he tells these guys, he tells people in the front office, the scouting department, the personnel department, these are the types of players that we want, right? And we know so much of it obviously is, are they a good teammate? Are they guys that obviously can produce on the field? Like those are two really big factors. And then there's a bunch of little branches that extend out as to, okay, does this player fit our team profile, our team DNA? And he lets those guys do that job. Like there's been this narrative. And look, Sean does rule sometimes with an iron fist. He came out this offseason and said, last year, my first year was kind of me coming around and peeing all over the trees, so to speak, right? Because you have to in a new situation, a new environment. You have to mark your territory. But when it comes to his collaboration with the staff, there was never any of that from him. He lets the college guys, the scouts, do their jobs, and they put together a lot of profiles, and he's very, very invested in what those guys have brought to the table. You add Cody Roark, who obviously has got a lot of experience there with Sean in New Orleans, now adding him to the front office. Now you add David Shaw, a well-respected voice. I don't think you're going to run into the issue, Sayre, where there are too many cooks in the kitchen. I think it's about figuring out this is our vision, and then how do we further align that and pull it in tighter to where we get to where we want to be. I think that's what this move ultimately is going to be here for Denver. I don't see any issues with it.
And I think to your point about Cody Roark being brought in, it really exemplifies how much Sean Payton does value that collaboration aspect. And we know that's something that George Payton values a lot because he said it from basically the moment that he was hired, that collaboration is a huge deal for him in terms of doing his job well. And you can't, anybody who knows anything about leadership knows that you don't want to always be the smartest person in the room. You want to surround yourself with people who have more wisdom than you. They have more experience than you. They maybe know more than you about a certain topic. And I'm not saying that's necessarily the case with Sean Payton here. These guys all know football really well. But what I'm saying is that he's making a clear, concerted effort towards collaboration because we know that he's the one who has final say when it comes to player personnel. Like when it comes to building this roster, Sean Payton is the guy. And if he wants somebody, like we heard about the phone call that he made to George Payton on day 3 of the NFL draft, and George Payton even being caught off guard because he's like, Sean's not usually up this early, right? And he's calling him and saying, hey, we need to trade up for Troy Franklin. Like it's that kind of, you're building a team with your friends, with your colleagues, as opposed to like, this is who I want. No, this is who I want. That's not what I perceive it to be, Cody. I think that
this isn't draft day.
It's not draft day. Exactly. And there may be times that it does get heated, things like that. But the fact that he brought in Cody Roark, who is somebody that he noted, like he was impressive in terms of the way that he was able to identify talent. And that doesn't get noticed by Sean Payton if he's constantly just out there saying, nope, my guy is the guy that I want and that I'm going to go get. He worked with Mickey Loomis for all these years. I think it's such an interesting perception of Payton that he does consistently rule with that iron fist. Yeah, he's a little old school in some ways. Yes, he's very direct in a lot of ways, but at the same time, it's not that he's just like, nope, whatever I say goes. And at the end of the day, if that final call has to be made, he's going to make it, but it's going to be a collaborative effort to arrive at that decision. And I think ultimately they've set themselves up for something really healthy if they do it the right way.
Well, and to your point as well, and I think when you bring in the type of guys that Sean and George have brought in, and the way I think from the leadership styles of Sean in terms of how he is as a football coach, I mean, obviously you can look at how players graded him in the NFLPA report. I think that speaks volumes in terms of how players look at Sean and how he is. Then you look at George Payton and how he leads. You look at ownership and how they're very forward thinking, and if there's a problem, if there's an area that's not up to standard, they're always looking for ways, how do we improve it, right? So when you look internally in terms of this roster, I think the perception of Sean Payton is that he is the all-seeing eye, which in some instances he may be in some cases. But when it comes to expertise, like Sean isn't the type of guy that says, I know everything about everyone and I know everything about everything that you can possibly imagine. It's all going to go through me. He is not that type of guy. He very much likes to defer. You know how much pressure that is? And Sean at this point, like last year, he was burning candles in his office to try to relax after a practice. You think he wants to go in there and say, all right, I have to figure out which undrafted rookie free agents. I have to figure out who we're adding to our draft board here. Like I'm doing it all by myself. That's not how Sean is. And I think that narrative has definitely been something a lot of people have run with. Sean, obviously, he's a kind of a callous guy in the eyes of a lot of people. You ask some fan base, like the Minnesota fan base. Anytime I post about Sean Payton, I get Vikings fans are like, I hate Sean Payton. Screw Sean Payton. Like, what's up with that? Like, I understand there's a whole bunch of stuff that goes on behind that. But I would say my experience of being around Sean, he's very much mellowed out in a sense because it's a new environment. He's getting used to a lot of the new things. He sees the consistent people that are there at practice. And I'll let Broncos fans in on a little secret. Instead of like the national media people that consistently talk about the Broncos, they have no idea what's going on with the team. And I can tell you it's more evident because we never see national media folks ever attend a Broncos practice. I can tell you that. Like maybe a couple of people once or twice, like Mike Tirico, like the commentators. If there's a primetime game, you see the primetime commentators attend practice, but you never see these talking heads that have so much to say about the Broncos ever attend practice. So just another reminder, switch to Locked On Sports today so you can get local coverage, including Locked On Broncos every single day for that, because we do attend practice. We do see what goes on, and we bring that here to all of you in Broncos country. But not only are there a lot of voices in the Broncos front office now, but there's another trusted voice with the addition of David Shaw for the ownership group. We'll talk about how important that is as the Broncos look to continue to sustain and try to build something strong in the long run. You're going to get that much more here on today's brand new episode, Locked On Broncos. Trust is important for the Broncos ownership group, and with the addition of David Shaw, they've added a trusted voice in that department. We'll tell you how that'll all play out here on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. Real quick, wanted to say thank you so much to everyone in Broncos country for tuning in, making us your first listen every single day. A special shout out to all the everydayers out there. People like Dennis that we always interact with, Devin in the comments on YouTube. We appreciate all of you in Broncos country here. But now we talk about trusted voices for ownership, trusted voices for Sean Payton. Sayre, this really is the overall, I'd say, like power arch here for where the Broncos are at, because we know ownership went all in for Sean Payton. Ownership is seemingly fully backed Sean Payton. He signed off on bringing in David Shaw, and obviously we've mentioned their ties together in terms of coaching staff. That's important as I think moving and working relationships go forward. But on top of that, there are also a lot of other people behind the scenes that we haven't had a chance to mention just yet, and how it pertains to ownership.
There's so many voices in that room. I mean, there's a lot of people involved in building an NFL team. I don't know that everybody necessarily realizes how many. You see the videos of war rooms on NFL Network and ESPN during the draft, things like that. But I mean, when we're talking about titles, we're talking about people that they've been intentionally put in positions of substantial influence over team. And like we've talked about a number of them, obviously Sean Payton, George Payton, now David Shaw being in the mix, Cody Roark being in the mix. But we haven't even mentioned the likes of like Darren Muji, the assistant general manager, Kelly Klein Van Callaghan, who Cody, I mean, she's the executive director of football operations and a special advisor to George Payton, and somebody who's been getting, some looks as a potential general manager herself at others. And Darren Muji as well could potentially get general manager looks elsewhere down the line. So, and there's tons of other people, maybe even names that fans would recognize, like Brian Stark, who's been around for a long time. He's the director of college scouting. AJ Durso, he's the director of pro personnel. Roman Pfeiffer, another former player who's a senior personnel executive. So there's a lot of people there. Why do you think it's important for this ownership group necessarily? As we talk about, I'm sure some people cringe anytime they hear the words trust and ownership in the same sentence in Broncos country these days. But why do you think it's so important for somebody like Shaw to be coming in when you have all these people with these titles already?
Well, I think obviously, Condoleezza Rice, think David Shaw have a great relationship. So I think in terms of if Greg Penner, Kerry Walton Penner, or Rob Walton, for example, had questions about, okay, what are we doing here? Like Condoleezza has an in there in terms of that. And I think her involvement on the football side is definitely a lot stronger than most people think, though it's a quiet advisement role. Like we even heard Sean Payton say, what was it, during the NFL draft process? He said, we had her heavily involved in our mock simulators in terms of what they were doing, in terms of the mock draft and seeing how things go. I think the challenge that you have here with all these voices, like, is everyone doing their part? Like you mentioned, like Kelly Klein Van Callaghan's role here for George Payton, really kind of the right hand, Darren Muji kind of the left hand there in terms of that structure there. While George is the GM, Sean Payton, like, ultimately has the final say. And I think a lot of people confuse that. Like they say, like, okay, well, if Sean Payton has the final say, Sean Payton's really the general manager. In most situations, folks, like in NFL front offices, the general manager's job is to do and to get whatever the head coach needs in order for them to field a successful team. So ultimately, the GM is the one who's picking up the phone and saying, hey, I'm calling Carolina, or I'm calling Seattle, and I'm talking to their guys. Sean Payton cannot pick up the phone and call John Schneider in Seattle and say, hey, we want to do this. That's not his job. That's not his role or his responsibility. So basically, he's the advisor. Like George says, Sean, what do you need in order for this team to be successful? And then obviously George has his own opinions and perspectives, and they talk and they deliberate on it. For me, I think you have to have like a cabinet, right? That's the word we're going to go with. A trusted cabinet of people who are experts in those fields or who do a good enough job at compiling the information that you need in order to make the best informed organizational decision possible, which ultimately lands on Sean Payton. Sean's going to make a lot of these final decisions when it comes to, okay, this is the guy we need to roll with. Have there been situations I think for Denver specifically, I think with Vic Fangio, I think with other guys, there have been situations where it wasn't necessarily the head coaches, like the head coach had like a little bit of say, but it was like, I don't know about that. Like, I think when you look at them deciding to go and draft Paxton Lynch back in 2016, I don't necessarily think Gary Kubiak was on board with that. I think he was very against that, but that was maybe a John Elway, Joe Ellis decision there. It seems now that Denver has got a situation in place. Stability is a nice word to kind of throw out there, where I would say that, okay, between Sean Payton, George Payton ownership, I feel like there is a lot of synergy, which hasn't been present with this Broncos organization in quite some time.
And that's really important to have. I mean, like you mentioned, the situation with Paxton Lynch, and then even after you move Gary Kubiak into the front office, remember the Broncos did that, I believe 2018, and there was the whole issue about, well, nobody went to John Elway didn't go to Josh Allen's pro day. Gary Kubiak was there, and Gary Kubiak was then, in the front office helping make those decisions. So that it's not always going to be perfect. People don't always get it right in either seat, right? Whether it's the coach making the decision or the general manager or ownership. It's just important, like you said, to have that cabinet of people making decisions. Otherwise, you run into situations where, I mean, quite frankly, the Dallas Cowboys have been pretty good at drafting in the first round the last decade or so. But at the same time, the way that Jerry Jones comes in and says, you know what, I want this guy, that's what's happening. That's kind of set this team back where they haven't been able to win anything meaningful since, I was a little kid back in the 90s. And so not that the Cowboys need to catch strays on this episode of Locked On Broncos or anything like that, but there's just examples all over the NFL of a poorly run front office and what that looks like. I think when you have something like this, you have the opportunity for, yes, there could be a little bit of chaos if there's too many people who feel. I do songwriting stuff, Cody. I've done things like that before, where if you have too many voices in the room, it can be really hard to actually work towards a common goal. You start to feel like, well, I want my ideas to come through, or I want to do what I don't feel like that's the right direction. You have to actively fight against that in environments where you're making big decisions, where you're making decisions that impact an NFL franchise, a billions of dollars organization. So synergy, like you said, is critical for these people in place. And I would love to hear from either George Payton or Sean Payton the next time they meet the media, which I'm sure will be in July, shortly before training camp at the barbecue, right? I'll be fascinated to hear what their plan is for this overall structure, because the titles alone of the people that are in this, in this hopefully synergistic structure and cabinet, like you mentioned, the titles alone kind of give you reason to be a little bit cautious in your optimism. But I think at the same time, when you have this many prominent voices, it can't help but get you excited that the right decisions in terms of building this team will eventually be made.
Well, and I like the direction that the Broncos are heading. And look, ultimately, they're going to be judged on wins and losses. That's how this organization, that's how the business of the NFL side always is. I'm just thankful they don't have Jerry Jones where, Dak Prescott, he's going to get a $60 million contract. And, hey, he's going to light it up. And we're going to win in the playoffs, baby. Go Cowboys. Like, to me, I just, that dynamic there. And I think for Jerry, like Jerry's a very vocal owner. I'm glad that the Broncos don't have ownership that is like that. That's vocal in those negative types of ways, because it's like, I've never seen a situation like it where it's like, all right, the Cowboys lose in the playoffs, right? The first person you hear from at a press conference is Jerry Jones. It's not the quarterback. It's not the head coach who was just in the game. It's literally Jerry when the season ends. He's the first person that everybody hears. To me, that's not a dynamic that I think would be good for the Broncos. I'm glad that they don't have that situation here with the Walton Penner family ownership group. But ultimately, can the Broncos get to more wins? That's the hope. And every move that they've made so far is to put them in that direction. We'll see if it pans out here. Maybe not in 2024, but maybe in the next 2 to 3 years. That's the window we're looking for here on Locked On Broncos. But with that said, Broncos Country, that'll wrap up today's episode of the show. Thank you so much to all the everydayers out there for listening, making us your first listen of the day every single day. We appreciate you so much for rocking with us. We will be back on Monday for a brand new episode because really we're going to start building up towards our training camp position previews. We know when the rookies are going to report on July 17th, the vets report on the 23rd. We anticipate the media barbecue is going to be on the 23rd, and then maybe the first day of training camp practice is going to be on the 24th there. Once we have the official dates for that, we'll let you know so you can go out there in Broncos Country. You can get your tickets. You can attend training camp. Come say hi to me if you have the opportunity to do so, and hopefully Sayre can make it over as well so we can all have a get-together, maybe do a live show there with everybody in Broncos Country. We appreciate you so much for rocking with us. We'll see you on Monday for a brand new episode of the show.